Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic as always. We are revisiting a system today, and it's we did pedostatic system a couple of weeks ago and seemed very popular. Lots of downloads and listens to that show. So we are going to complement that today with the vacuum system. And really, we're going to talk gyroscopic instruments that are driven by the vacuum system, along with we're going to throw in the turn coordinator to try and make this a more teaching or lesson-oriented type podcast, to hopefully help all of you perform better on your check rides and really just understand the systems and hopefully do better in case you ever have a failure. Wally, have you ever had a vacuum system failure, any part of it?
Well, before we even start, I'm going to say this because when we came up with the idea of this show, I came up with the idea of saying what I'm about to say, and I wanted to say it. So this show is really going to suck.
There you go. Maybe we should make that the title of the show.
Getting back to vacuum pump failures, as we were prepping for this show, I was asking Bobby how many hours they get out of a vacuum pump. Before I got my instrument rating, this was a long time ago, but before I took my check ride, I had 3 vacuum pump failures. So I became a believer, very much a believer in partial panel training. And in fact, probably my instrument students, we probably had the vacuum instruments covered up for sure more than half the time. But I'd say 60 to 70% of the time that we went out and flew, it was partial panel just because I had it happen 3 different times, 3 different airplanes, by the way.
In IMC or VMC or?
Oh, no. It was all VMC. It was all
okay.
VMC. I wasn't instrument rated at the time, but the vacuum pump failure or a vacuum system, well, basically every vacuum system failure I've had has been because of a vacuum pump failure. It's hard to recognize. You don't get a flag that says inoperative. Some airplanes you may get an enunciation that says vacuum, but the vacuum gauge or the suction gauge, as some manufacturers call it, is probably something that's not in our scan, and I don't know. It probably ought to be. I've always thought that kind of the worst scenario would be a VFR night flight with no moon or anything, no no prominent horizon, and having a vacuum pump failure. Because what happens is as these gyros and these instruments begin to spin down, they don't come to a screeching halt. They spin down. So these instruments go from being, call it 100% accurate to 99%, 98, 97, 96. And if that attitude indicator begins to tilt and you're following it, you could put yourself in a very bad situation.
No doubt. The degradation of these instruments, no matter how or what they're doing to fail, it could be a scary proposition. And that's why I'm a little biased because I just got back from Redbird migration, but that's why a sim is so valuable to this type of training, right? You're in the clouds. You can be completely in the clouds. You can simulate that at night, no visual reference to the ground, and degrade the pump or fail the system in some way. And the attitude indicator is not just going to fall off the map. It's going to, as you say, become a 3-degree pitch. And as you try to correct that, then your heading's going to start moving. And your heading's going to start moving a lot, maybe even start spinning. If that heading indicator started spinning and that attitude indicator started showing a turn opposite of that spinning heading indicator, it's going to be hard for any of us to keep those wings level. Thank goodness
Yeah.
most planes now have a turn coordinator, which is why we're talking about it, that is driven by something different than the vacuum pump that gives us kind of an out, right?
Right, right. And I was talking to a young man this morning about it, and we were talking about vacuum pump failures, and I used the analogy. I don't know. I hope it wasn't too out of line, but I said a vacuum pump failure is like dying of cancer, as opposed to a heart attack, where it's boom. It's usually pretty quick. This is a long, slow process to see the instruments fail, and just recognizing it. And I suggested to this guy that he has a couple of like the instrument covers that your instructors may use to cover up the instruments to practice partial panel. I think all pilots ought to carry those in their bag, simply because if you do have a failure of this system and you're continuing the flight, it's probably a lot easier to put a suction cup cover over those instruments than to have it staring you right in your face, because we've been trained our whole piloting career to watch the instruments, follow the instruments, believe the instruments. Now we're saying, just kidding, these two in the middle that are right smack dab in the middle aren't any good anymore. So it's hard to quit following that. So
I think it's almost impossible, right? So I'm a big believer in carrying those. I carry a couple suction cups that I could use to cover them up in a steam gauge aircraft, and then plenty of Post-its if it was ever in the G1000 that I was concerned about an instrument giving me bad information, just to get it off my scan, because you're inevitably going to make a reaction based on what you're seeing. If you've flown 500, 1,000 hours trusting that instrument, it's going to be very hard to ignore it for sure. So let's kind of give an overview of how the entire system works. A little easier on video sometimes, but I think the podcast works well to talk through it. And this is in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 10, all kinds of sources on the internet. But you can get the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge from the FAA as a free download if you want that. We'll try and put that in the show notes as well. But there's a vacuum inbound filter somewhere in your aircraft. It's probably in these Cessnas and Pipers somewhere in the cabin, so that we're actually starting with clean air from somewhere and sucking that air in. As Wally said, this show really sucks. But the air is going to get sucked in through that filter, and then it goes through the instruments, through the suction gauge, the instruments that are driven by this vacuum pressure are the attitude indicator and heading indicator in most aircraft. Sometimes the turn coordinator could also be vacuum air driven. Once they go through the instruments to spin the gyros that are making those instruments stay erect or work through precession, they go through a vacuum relief valve, which is keeping them kind of constant at different power settings. Spinning a vacuum pump that's engine driven could be spinning at different RPM, so that this vacuum relief valve is really what kind of keeps them all spinning at the same rate. And then outside of that vacuum pump, there's a vent that lets the extra air leave the system. And I ask this question quite a bit because it seems common sense, but new pilots don't know these things. And I remember being a new pilot. Is the vacuum pump pushing air through it, or is it pulling air through it? And the name gives it away because it's a vacuum pump. But I was taught, Primacy lives here, that it's not a push system, because it could become very dangerous pushing that air through those systems and blowing those gyros up, or having that pressure relieved on the other side of those instruments. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think the vacuum relief valve and the vacuum pump is what's helping regulate some of that pressure, causing that, because it's being pulled through those instruments, not something that's going to happen and cause problems in those instruments.
Yeah, and when if you happen to be in an airplane where you can actually open the cowling and see inside, there's all kinds of stuff in that engine compartment, and a typical vacuum pump is about the size and shape of a coffee mug, if you will. Mm-hmm. So, it might be something if you ever happen to see an engine uncowled, to go up to the mechanic and just say to him, hey, where's the vacuum pump? And just go take a look at it. With that in mind, I asked Bobby, and this was a very informal survey. I told you I had 3 before I got my instrument rating, and then I've had 2 since then. One was not too long ago in my Saratoga, which the vacuum system does nothing but power standby instruments. So it was not that big a deal, but I looked over there, and yeah, sure enough, that attitude indicator and the attitude indicator over on the right side weren't working, and lo and behold, guess what? We had 0 vacuum pressure. So, I had to have that pump replaced. But it seems to me that you get about 1,500 hours, 2,000 hours out of a vacuum pump. And it's probably more years driven than hours.
I think for us, again, not scientific here, everybody, but for me or for this flight school, it's the number of hot and cold seasons that we go through. So in a year where, if you're not from Texas, you may not believe this, but we might have summer, winter, spring, winter, summer, winter, spring, winter, summer, all in the span of about 5 months, because it can go from freezing cold in November to 85, 90 degrees with 100% humidity again in late November, to really, really cold in December. I've worn shorts on Christmas more than I can count, to freezing in January, to warm in January, to ice in February. And I think all that up and down in temperature changes the things that are in the actual instruments themselves, which is a lot of that ceramic and that I guess contraction and expansion and contraction and expansion because of the hot and cold just kind of wears those instruments out and wears those gyros out. And the less fluctuation in temperature we have, the longer those instruments and that vacuum system seem to operate correctly.
Okay. Well, that's a good thought. So chances are, if you fly enough, you're going to see this at some point. Now, a lot of the newer airplanes don't have vacuum systems, and a lot of the older airplanes, people choose to take the vacuum system out. It's an economic decision. Probably doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense to do that, but some people choose to do it nonetheless.
Yeah, we've done it in a few aircraft and thinking about doing it in more, but it's a $10,000 quote unquote upgrade versus a $1,000 keep it as is and fight through each instrument at a time, right? That's assuming you're changing one instrument or one vacuum pump and a little bit of work. It's a super reliable system until it breaks, right? And that's the beauty of it. I think that there's all kinds of reasons why you don't want that to happen in IMC, but in VMC, it's not that big of a deal. As long as you can navigate. We talked about this with instrument approaches and using an electronic flight bag. Would you use ForeFlight to navigate if that was your last choice? And I think the answer we would all say is, heck yeah, we're going to use it. And I've always been kind of in the same boat that if I lost my vacuum system, I'm going to use my Stratus and the heads-up display on ForeFlight to give me my synthetic vision and kind of what I'm doing. I'm going to use everything I got to stay upright. And I think that would work really well. In the experimental world, you can make this pretty economical. But in a typed aircraft that's used for type training, then you're not gonna. It's not that inexpensive. These FAA tickets and stickers and certificates cost a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah. And I think getting back to actually flying the airplane when you have that, this is a reason to keep the scan going. You don't want to get fixated on that attitude indicator. All things being equal, if everything's working just fine, I mean, I guess you could, just as long as you're keeping the wings level and the pitch where it needs to be. You're not going to climb, you're not going to descend, you're not going to turn. But that's the reason for the scan. I had an instructor one time that would always say, eyes moving fast, hands moving slow. Eyes moving fast, hands moving slow. And I've used that many, many, many times over the years. So you want to, you're basically evaluating everything. You're looking over at that airspeed indicator. Okay, does it make sense? Attitude, altimeter, VSI, heading, turn coordinator. Are they all jiving? And once you get one that's doesn't seem to be playing nicely with the other five, it's time to kind of back things off and evaluate. Try to figure out what's happened. Have I lost my attitude indicator, or have I lost my vacuum system? Well, we have a vacuum gauge, or a suction gauge, so that's kind of easy. If you think the attitude indicator has failed, take a look at the suction gauge. If the suction gauge is at 0, well, yeah, it certainly has failed, and that DG is going to fail, or it probably already has.
Yeah, and I have seen, it's probably far, far less common, but I have actually seen a suction gauge that was stuck at 0, and that could be pretty disorienting to someone. I definitely wouldn't fly into IMC with that, but again, you wouldn't really know what was causing that if unless you could open that up and diagnose that suction gauge was wrong, because the outcomes of that being at 0 or the vacuum system having no pressure would be pretty daunting for sure in that environment. Normally what we see at the fly school is something that's tumbling, and when it's tumbling, it's normally the instrument itself, right? So an attitude indicator or a heading indicator that just won't stay erect is normally that actual device itself. The system's still working, the vacuum pump, the relief valve, and the suction gauge, all that's working. It's normally just an instrument. Why do you think the turn coordinator is electronic, Wally?
Well, for diversification, for another word for it, if we have a vacuum-powered turn coordinator and we lose the vacuum, then we've lost all kinds of ability to tell if the airplane is turning, if we're in IMC conditions or there's nothing visible outside. So for the most part, and if you go into your airplane or your airplane that you rent, if you look at the instruments themselves, it probably says on the turn coordinator, most of them say DC ELEC, and that means DC electric. So that would tell you that it's electric. The heading indicator, the DG, and the attitude indicator probably say vacuum on them or suction. The airplane I was in this morning, I believe one said suction and one said vacuum. But the answer is right there. I ask these questions on all private, commercial, and certainly instrument check rides. So we discuss all this, and all you got to do is look at the instrument. The answer is right there.
And if they were all ran on electric, then you have a single source of failure if you have an electric failure. And again, I think it's ingenious how we've gotten to where we're at. And unfortunately, probably a lot of people suffered their demise because of how we got to where we're at. But having systems that are diversified, as you said, running on different pieces of technology, vacuum or electronic systems, then we have some backups there that will help keep us safe and keep us flying along the way. Yeah,
and I think what's very important that that we need to be aware of is if you are in an airplane that has been either upgraded or never had a vacuum system, I think you have to understand the backup behind your primary attitude indicator. Most of them will have basically a standby battery, and those batteries are supposed to be good for about 5 or 6 hours in most cases. But that's something that we need to include in our pre-flight, because if we do have an electrical failure, and everybody knows that electrical failures are near and dear to my heart, if we do have an electrical failure and we don't have that backup battery, we're going to lose our ability to keep the wings level, and that's a big deal. So I think maybe a lot of us jump into new airplanes and say, oh, gee, this has let's say a Garmin G5. It's got 2 G5s in it. And maybe we just don't understand that they might or they might not. I know I had put something in my 172, and it was an option to get the backup battery, which I did, but you didn't have to get it.
You better know what you got in something like that,
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's driving the G5s if it doesn't have a do those have gyros? I don't even know that I know the answer to that, to be honest. Are those gyro driven, or are they driven by something else?
I don't know if there's an AHRS. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't.
That's where I was taking us down to the AHRS route, right? So if a system, if an aircraft doesn't have vacuum systems like a G1000 or most, I would call them glass cockpits today, they have an AHRS system. And the AHRS system stands for Air Data Attitude Heading Reference System. And it's a computer, for no better intent, that is electronically calculating all those flight parameters. And you would be very wise to have a backup battery, a standby battery of sorts. And the one question that I can almost stump everybody on, but you won't be stumped if you're a behind the prop listener, is what's required from the backup battery or from the systems in the handbook, the pilot handbook, the POH, for a system that has a backup battery, like a standby battery in a G1000. And many people look up and think and wonder, well, surely it's required equipment. So they normally say in VMC it's not required, but in IMC, yeah, it is required. And the reality is that it's not required equipment in the United States for IMC or VMC, shockingly. Now, Bobby's personal minimums say I'm never going to fly an all-electric aircraft without a standby battery that tests like it's working well. But it's only required in Europe, from what I understand, to be required for flight into IMC. But there's no way I'd fly a G1000 aircraft without a standby battery that was operational in IMC for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what kind of things, we're going to a check ride quiz here a little bit, right? Other than just how these instruments work, which I'm assuming you ask applicants, what is it that you reference or relate to on these 3 instruments for private pilot check rides? What are you asking about them? Is it pretty mundane, low-level questions, or are you diving pretty deep into how the systems work?
Yeah, no, it's. I like to think of it as operational. I will say, what would be the result of a failed vacuum pump?
Okay.
And in general, applicants are pretty darn good on it.
My dome light would quit working. Is that true? My dome light would quit working.
I think the dome light would work. I think it'd be just fine. And of course, on an instrument check ride, we will actually fly an approach with the loss of the primary flight instruments. Now, in a vacuum pump airplane, it's easy. I cover up the 2 instruments that are vacuum powered. I had one this morning, and it's really pretty easy. And again, it's with the big stickers or suction cups or whatever on top of the instruments, it's really fairly easy to recognize it, and maybe not so easy to fly the airplane. But one thing that I have been very successful in is being able to do time turns, and being able to do math in my head. I know if I'm heading 240 and ATC wants me to turn left heading 180, I know that's a 60-degree turn, and I know it's going to take me 20 seconds. So I put the airplane into turn for 20 seconds, roll it out, check my compass, and make small adjustments. I know a 10-degree turn is going to take about 3 seconds, and so forth. So those skills come into play very much so especially if you've lost your heading indicator or your primary flight display. Bottom line is, if you've lost your attitude indicator, if you're not climbing and descending and your airspeed is staying constant and you're not turning, you ought to be in good shape. And again, that's assuming a constant power. Now, it comes into play when we have to start descending. So, being able to descend at whatever rate per minute is your typical approach descent profile is something that hopefully you've done a lot with your instructor. I'm talking about for an instrument rating. But, you may think, well, this is kind of boring and dumb to be descending at 500 feet a minute, but, that might be what you're stuck with. You may need to do that.
Well, that might save your life too, right? I was thinking
absolutely.
Probably a less of an angle than that. If it's me flying an IMC, I'm gonna probably declare an emergency, but I'm definitely gonna tell them that I need to start descending way before I need to make sure that I'm not making massive big adjustments, because that's what's gonna really start confusing your body for sure.
Yeah, and I was thinking flying a 3-degree glide slope, flying an approach like that.
So what else? Do you go any deeper on CFII check rides? Is there any other than knowing operational and kind of common failures of the system, anything that applicants need to be thinking about as they prepare for check rides?
Not really. On the more advanced airplanes, knowing your different options. I mean, can we take that screen that's right in front of you and put it over on the information that's on that screen that's right in front of you, and move it over to the right screen? And that might be real easy to do. And you just, instead of looking straight ahead, you're looking a little bit to the right. But I still think it's very, very important to be able to use the traditional standby instruments, which, again, might be a vacuum system, but it may be an electric G5 over in the corner that's about a tenth of the, well, maybe not a tenth, but about an eighth of the size of which we're used to looking at. So, I mean, I know on a 777 where we've got a very small standby attitude indicator, but we have 3 others, so we're in a world of hurt if we're down to that.
Yeah, that's a scary proposition for sure. Well, I remember when I was first a young pilot, that these systems seemed very complicated. I think the experience of owning a fly school and replacing them on the fleet of 20 that we have has taught me a lot about how the systems work. But it really is just a few pages in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, a couple videos you can watch. Listening to this show hopefully will help you. But we want you to be a safe pilot and know what's going on in that system, if the system's failing and or if the system's working. Just know the systems. Read your POH. We have a plane that has 2 vacuum pumps, and I would bet in the grand scheme of things, very few people know that that's got a dual vacuum pump system, and that's just for redundancy, right? And I would feel pretty confident in that aircraft no matter where I was at, because there's the redundancy. So
Right.
it makes it safe. You be safe, fly safely, and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.